Hi, I'm Rora.
Hi, I'm Jane,
We are Birds of Clay.
and this is Clay Connections, a short podcast series where we delve into the intersection of well-being, community, and of course, clay. We would like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians on the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge the rich history of art, craft, and storytelling that has been occurring for millennia, and acknowledge elders past, present, and country as provider, protector, and guide. Working with clay is intrinsically linked to country, and we would not be here without the care and connection that our First Nations peoples have shown for thousands of years on this continent we call Australia. Okay, today everyone, we have a wonderful guest, Eva Masterman. Welcome to the podcast, Eva.
Hi, Jane. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm so excited to talk to you. So I first came across Eva when I was listening to her podcast, Clay Commons, and it was an amazing podcast. You explain it as a podcast about community ceramics and clay as a force for good. And I think that wraps it up really well. It was full of stories that inspired me and dovetailed really well into what I'm interested in. So yeah, excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, me too. I'm so glad it resonated.
Yeah, very much so. So Eva, you're an artist, a writer, a community worker, podcast host, and just generally amazing person. So we're very excited to have you here. Is there anything you'd like to share about yourself before we get started?
Not particularly. I mean, I guess I sort of sometimes start with sort of positionality statements just to kind of sort of say a bit about who I am and what my kind of privileges are. I mean, I'm a white middle-class person, queer woman from the UK. I come from a kind of middle-class background, but have sort of immigration in my on my mum's side. So I kind of come from a line of Ukrainian Jews, if you go far enough back, and some Irish bumped in there as well. So it's but I kind of have I was privately educated, and I don't come from a clay background actually, which is maybe the interesting thing for this conversation, because I came to clay through fine art. So I've always had quite a kind of expanded sort of understanding of making and how that kind of relates to my identity and my family as well. Actually, I've got a lot of artists in my family. So yeah, but it's interesting because I think a lot of my current research and a lot of my work, and especially the work of the Clay Commons, kind of comes from a sort of frustration with some of the privileges that I have had, sort of especially through education and kind of going through a sort of a private education system, and sort of seeing the kind of elitism and the sort of stark contrasts of what happens when you kind of have those, when you come through that, and how those systems aren't really supporting people, or aren't supporting. It's not a case of aren't really, they're just not. So it's sort of interesting kind of going through these sort of different levels of art and creative education, and kind of seeing how that's changed.
It's interesting with clay, because clay kind of sits in this, it's kind of in fine arts, but it can also exist in a very crafty kind of community space, which is something I really love about your work, is that you're kind of trying to draw all those threads together. So you talked about your fine art degree. Is that how you got into clay?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. Yes and no. I mean, I suppose the sort of the story that I tell about my kind of fine art is that I was I assume it's maybe the same in Australia, but in the UK, I graduated my BA in 2008. And it was just at that point where workshops were kind of starting to kind of be homogenized in creative practice university degrees. So previously to that, it was very likely that you would have had a workshop kind of per discipline. So especially with fine art, we had our own workshop. So we had metal, ceramics, casting, wood, and a bit of stone casting, and we had technicians that were specifically servicing the fine art department. And by the time I graduated, that had really kind of changed, and the whole thing had just been kind of pulled together to service the entire university. But yeah, I was really lucky, and basically I just had a real crush on the technician. So she's was this amazing woman called Elaine Wilson, and we became really good friends afterwards, and she got me my first job, and sadly she passed away a few years ago. But yeah, she was just this amazing person, and I kind of I discovered the workshops pretty early on, and yeah, liked her. So
that's great. I feel like crushes drive so much of our lives that we just don't really talk about, but it's really true. Yeah.
But then also, fell in love with the material as well. But I think making from like I said, I have artists in my family, but I was also just a kid who was always making. I wasn't necessarily clay, but my grandma was a real craft person, and she kind of introduced me to salt dough, just like salt and flour and water. But I spent my entire, all of my summer holidays, every kind of available moment, just sort of making things and kind of mixing things up and putting them together. And then as I kind of got a bit older, my great aunt was a professional artist, and she had a studio, so I kind of went and hung out with there when we went to visit London. So it was making with clay-like materials has been something that I've always done. But from a kind of professional point of view, yes, I guess fine art, my sort of technician crush was probably.
That's great. And what do you think and obviously you just talked about having a history with that kind of 3D tactile material. And do you think that is why clay spoke to you so much, or was there another reason? Basically, I'm asking is why clay?
Why clay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that. I mean, again, not to be unromantic about it, but I was just quite good at it. It sort of was just a material that always seemed to work for me. I think people kind of have these sort of horror stories of things like kind of cracking and blowing up and whatever. But it just, I think this happens a lot with craftspeople when you speak to them. Certainly the kind of conversations I've had with people across different disciplines is that you just find your material and your body kind of weirdly remembers it somehow. There's a kind of familiarity about it. And that's just something that I always felt with clay. It was always a material that just felt right, which I think, is a kind of resonance, having spoken to a lot of people for the podcast and for the sort of my PhD research, this idea of clay as, it's a material that we've had in our kind of human culture for 20,000 plus years or something. It's a material that it's probably the oldest material that we've ever used. So it's deeply ingrained in our culture building and our meaning making across every single landmass and every single culture. So it's this material that is incredibly, I personally think it's something that is really deeply kind of part of our DNA in some capacity. So I think it's very immediate. It's kind of easy to make something out of. It kind of responds to you. There's a push, there's a pull to it. It's formed, but it's unformed. So there's a lot of things there to work with, which I think very immediately can form a connection and kind of create an experience for people, which I think is one of the reasons why, outside of my own personal experience, why I think it's one of the a material that does a lot in community spaces.
Yeah, obviously in Australia, we have a lot of First Nations perspectives around, and I always think, Earth is clay, and there's, for our First Nations people in Australia, country is much bigger story than just place and dirt. It's holds so much, and for me, and I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of First Nations people, but for my own personal experience, there's something about clay that feels quite universal and big, but then also really humble. and fills you up on all different levels. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, maybe we're going slightly off topic now, but I think that's one of the things that I really think we've lost in kind of Western culture, sort of post-industrialization and kind of through colonialism and various other things that, like, you know, and I'm always quite kind of, because I'm not a religious person, but I'm kind of coming to a sort of sense of spirituality almost through my experiences with clay, because it is a material that is maybe not so much now, because we kind of, you know, the way it's sort of industrially made and processed is sort of a whole other conversation. But, you know, when you kind of speak to or look at or kind of research or kind of hear about, like you say, kind of indigenous relationships with this material, it is the ancestors, you know, and it is like physically it's made up out of millions of years worth of dead live matter. So it's this incredibly potent material that is both past, present, and then has this potential to kind of create a future or kind of visualize a future, both through the kind of objects that we make, but also in terms of like how we might sort of build communities around it, or sort of think about the sort of connections that it kind of fosters. So yeah, I think that kind of divorcing of a kind of sense of spirituality or connection to history and land and all of that kind of thing has been really like lost through capitalism essentially. And I think ceramics, especially as a discipline, is really guilty of that actually, in terms of like, again, sort of from a UK perspective, you know, most of the kind of craft theory that I've been engaging with is so centered on the finished object, and how that relates, and the value of making out of clay is to do with the value that you place on this object, whether that's in relation to kind of material culture or kind of actual, you know, monetary value. But I think there's a lot to be said there, a lot there to uncover, which is actually about the kind of the back end of it, and sort of the idea of clay as a metaphor. So I've been trying to kind of shift my language when I'm talking about it to sort of speaking about clay rather than ceramics, because for me, clay is all of these things we were just talking about, you know, its potential, its diversity, its its inclusion, it's a multiplicity of difference, but held within one thing. And I think there's something really potent there, as opposed to sort of thinking about ceramics, which has a place for sure, but it feels like that's more of a tool rather than this sort of way of thinking.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Something people who listen to this podcast will know is that I'm really excited about clay having agency. And I have done a master's degree in social ecology, which was really deep in the post-human and the new materialism and First Nations perspectives. And I think I've really found my own journey working with clay is that I feel like I'm co-creating.
Yeah.
And it's something I've never felt before, creating art. And it's something that clay, I don't know, it's got like a zingy energy. And, you know, I don't want to sound too woo, but I do think there is a spiritual element, and it's good to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, I really love this idea of it being agency. Like whenever I kind of talk to, or when I sort of teach sort of ceramics or clay, it feels like having a conversation to me, you know, like, and this is the thing where I was sort of saying it's like formed but unformed. You know, your starting off point isn't blank. You know, you're dealing with something, and it is very like bodily as well. You know, I mean, I always think that kind of clay at sort of leather hard stage always feels a bit like flesh to me. You know, it sort of has that kind of resistance to kind of like muscle or something. And yeah, there's a conversation back and forth, and that's again the other thing that's really amazing about clay, again in sort of community settings, or when we're kind of working with it, or when people work with it sort of in trauma, or sort of through trauma, or kind of in sort of well-being kind of more generally, is that it kind of teaches you resilience and
kind of humbles you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
yeah
And kind of confidence, because you can't push it too far. It forces you to slow down. it forces you to pay attention and be present. Because if I've had things, I'm sure everybody has, you kind of go, oh, I'll just build this extra like inch of it, and you do half a centimeter and the entire thing collapses. Because it's just like, no, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm not going to. And you have to start listening to that. So it kind of teaches you this sort of reciprocity, which again, I think is something that we're really lacking in kind of capitalist settings, because it's all about that kind of individualization, and you as a kind of separate entity. And when you're working with clay, you're, like you say, you're having a conversation, and it's a negotiation, I think.
Yeah, and I think it reflects back to you a lot too. Like, I know just running some hand building workshops, like there's some people who will come in angry and they won't be able to get that pinch pot to look how they want, and it's just this kind of clay's kind of showing them that they need to slow down and they need to process that emotion. And like I really believe in that.
Yeah, I do too. And again, I think it's there's too much, again, to sort of bring it back to the sort of education settings. I think I was reading something interesting the other day about, like, because ceramics is a kind of an academic discipline, is very orientated around this idea of skill, right? Like, you kind of have, that's one of the kind of primary markers of whether it's like good ceramics, is like how well it's been made. And yet you're not going to be able to teach somebody how to be a kind of master potter in a 3-year HE course. Like, that's not how that works. So there's still this sort of focus, or this sort of drive in sort of UK universities, I think, to get to the end, and to, like, as opposed to sort of sitting in that kind of critical reflection, or that kind of the sort of potency of making, and kind of thinking about why we're making something, rather than just sort of focusing on the thing that we're trying to get to. And I don't think the end result doesn't really change. Like, you still make something, but I think the sort of the intention setting there is slightly different.
Yeah. I think I'm seeing that a bit at our university at the moment, is that, we do one semester of wheel throwing, and everyone wants to be able to throw everything after 6 months of wheel throwing, and we're like, no, like it's just a taste, and then it's kind of the journey begins there. Yeah. So in Australia, like, ceramics and working with clay is just booming. Like, it seems to be a really big, popular thing to do at the moment. Are you experiencing the same thing in the UK?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, my research wouldn't really have a home if it wasn't so popular, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think the same thing seems to be happening. There's a delay in the States in relation to the kind of decline of formal education. So I can talk about this, what I've kind of gleaned from the kind of the US in a bit, but it's interesting because I think it does. I was reading something the other day about New Zealand, and it seems like New Zealand, potentially Australia, and the UK are in similar kind of situations where formal education, so sort of secondary and tertiary craft education more generally, but specifically ceramics, has kind of collapsed, like, or is in the process of being kind of just kicked out of our university and sort of school systems. And yet there's this huge rise of community spaces and kind of DIY sort of hobbyist movements, and then also I would say kind of self-led or peer-led kind of professional spaces as well. So it's really interesting, that relationship, I think, like what is happening there, for sure.
Yeah, it's really happening. Like, currently me and Rora, who run the podcast, we're in a ceramics department at one of the last universities in Australia that has a ceramics department. And I think we might have just held on long enough. We actually got an increasing student body. We're one of the only increasing student bodies across our university at the moment, which is pretty amazing. And I do think it's those people there are a lot of people who started out as hobbyists who are looking for something. But I don't know if we're doing, because we're in such a small regional area, we don't have that studio culture, the kind of community studio culture. So people are looking for that, and I think finding uni, and there's a bit of a disconnect that can happen there sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think maybe like sort of looping back to some of that, the sort of quick comment I made earlier, like, you know, what's the point of these different levels of of education? Like, why are we teaching ceramics in the first place, or why are we teaching clay in the first place? Like, what does it do? Because if you're wanting to just, and I think this basically, I think the demographic or the kind of the habits of craft people are really changing, and who is interested in accessing this material is also changing. So what I think happened in the UK was, we've had, you know, decades now of cuts to the arts more generally, like kind of government cuts. And obviously in the UK, I'm not sure what the funding stream is in Australia, but certainly in America, in the States, it's very kind of entrepreneurial based, and you don't get any state funding. Whereas in the UK, all of our arts funding pretty much was government based or kind of charity based. So now that's been kind of like cut away. There's a huge deficit in terms of like how our cultural spaces are being funded, and we don't really have the culture of philanthropy at the moment. So there isn't like kind of private funding that at the moment. There is bits and pieces of it, but it's not anywhere near as kind of prevalent as what you might find in the US. So there's a real issue there, and it's also the same thing has happened to the universities, where we've now got this sort of like neoliberal push. We have rising fees, like in terms of what, let's use ceramics as an example, the ceramics courses can offer. You know, they've got a huge footprint in the university. They take up a lot of space. They're very expensive to run, and they can only really service, I mean, I would say probably maximum 20 people.
Yeah, it's really, so true.
They're really pushing that at those sort of those numbers at the spaces that still are kind of holding on to that territory. But you know, they don't make economic sense in the new kind of business model of universities. So of course they're going to be pushed out. You know, I don't see, like, it, of course that's happened. And also I think it's kind of important to point out that BAs or kind of craft courses, or even like fine art courses, they're quite a new phenomena. You know, like, it's not like they've been around for centuries. You know, they've only actually been pushed into or kind of pulled into the sort of academic sphere within the last sort of 50 odd years. I mean, I know there's a couple of kind of outliers within that. But, you know, as we know it, this sort of idea of kind of ceramics, especially as like a kind of an academic discipline, is pretty new. And it's kind of gone into this sort of beast, this sort of industrial complex of education, and just hasn't been able to hold up to it because the education system has shifted so quickly. And then on top of that, I think as well, like, you know, we've had the rise of the internet, so more people are kind of accessing like how-to videos, and we had COVID, so of course everyone was like kind of constant, you know, everyone was like making sourdough and like doing all of this kind of stuff. You know, like if you were kind of middle class, you know, you were taking photographs of lemons and making sourdough or whatever it was, you know, like, so you kind of had you've had this sort of like slow kind of like push towards a kind of almost like, I think, a kind of wartime sort of aesthetic, which I think kind of ties in with like the Great British Bake Off and the Great Pottery Throwdown, which are great in some ways, but also I think quite dangerous in terms of like how they're sort of starting to, again, sort of co-opt the sort of aesthetic, the sort of pastoral kind of nice aesthetic of like kind of craft and making things. And I think but I mean, it's got more people interested in it as a hobby for sure. But I think it's quite kind of dangerous to sort of think about that as the only, to perpetuate that within our kind of education spheres, because I think actually there's a lot of revolutionary potential hidden within kind of craft and ceramics, and sort of thinking about it as a kind of politicized discipline and practice, I think is it isn't something, it isn't a lens that has been kind of like put onto kind of craft and ceramics very much. And I think it's something that really, like, there's a movement-ish, like there's a sort of beginning of a movement in craft theory, kind of thinking about it as a politicized material. But I think it's something that we, especially as our structures of education, of formal education, are changing, we really need to start thinking about what we're offering and what craft and ceramics can offer beyond just making nice pots.
That's so good. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, the Great Pottery Throwdown is huge here. Like, and I must admit, it was a big part of me probably getting into ceramics, like just watching it, and I think there's a lot of sides to it. Like, it's one of the only shows on Australian TV where you see true diversity. You know, there's always people of color, queer people from the queer community represented in this show, and the Bake Off's the same. Like, I always feel like it's like, oh, these are some really interesting people on this show, but at the same time, like, there's art being made that's complete appropriation on these shows that has no reference to First Nations histories or even artists, where people are taking direct inspiration from someone's art and not acknowledging that. It's like this kind of, you're right, it's like pastoral kind of warm fuzzy. So yeah, it's complex.
It really is. And I think, like, I mean, for my mind, Bernard Leach has got an awful lot to answer for in terms of like the kind of the culture of appropriation that's come up through sort of studio pottery. Like, and I think also that's then reinforced with our kind of how we write about ceramics and craft, very much around a focus on kind of how you've made something, and you know, where, as opposed to sort of, and you know, this sort of idea that you can just sort of like pick a mix across different cultures and just sort of like grab a little bit from everything. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, that's artists in every kind of, and human culture develops because of that, you know. Like, it's not to say that borrowing or kind of being inspired by kind of different cultures is a bad thing, but there does seem to be a kind of lack of critical engagement in, I personally think anyway, in how ceramics, I think especially as well, has really allowed itself to kind of develop as a kind of critical discipline, because it, you know, it sort of comes from, I think, again, this sort of like movement into, because it's something to do with the kind of the professionalization of ceramics as a discrete discipline from other visual culture, visual material, visual arts. So as discrete from design or as discrete from fine art. And they were kind of trying to sort of professionalize studio pottery essentially. And how they did that was by, I mean, Bernard Leach attached it to a bunch of, like, I don't know, appropriated ideas from Japan and East Asia, but it was also very much kind of attached around this sort of idea of skill and sort of skill and process, because that's the thing that made it different. And then it kind of got kind of romanticized around this sort of as, like, you know, the answer to kind of industrialization, which again I think is interesting in relation to what's happening now with the kind of the advent of technology and the kind of alienation that's happening through kind of internet and kind of digital technologies, and how we're kind of seeing, you could probably put those two things together as like a kind of a push-pull, where you're kind of, you know, it's like the sort of 2008 financial crisis and like all of this sort of excessive kind of capitalism sort of suddenly starting to kind of collapse slightly, and like the kind of, you know, everyone's now got phones in their hands and this sort of thing. And then there feels like there's been a very kind of intentional kind of push back, both in a good and a bad way, with, like, you know, artisanal coffee and baking and the Bake Off and, like, you know, all of these kind of things where it's like, actually you can kind of like push back and sort of return to something that is more kind of deemed as like more authentic somehow, but then that's where I think the kind of criticality really needs to kind of come in, because if you're not really properly assessing what that looks like, it's not to say that there isn't a better way of living outside of capitalism and that all of these things are kind of important as elements of that. I completely believe that, you know, craft is going to be the way out of all of this, to be honest, or will offer one way of getting out of it. But it also is very easy to kind of fall into a kind of romanticized sort of idea of the sort of pastoral and, you know, bygone days of like, you know, in my time it was, you know, all of these kind of things which actually don't mean anything.
It's so interesting, Eva, because it's kind of holding two things together at once, isn't it? It's like, you know, like I have seen the beautiful individual kind of growth and awakening of someone who touches clay and plays with clay and makes their little ring holder in a overpriced 3-hour ceramic workshop. Not overpriced, well priced.
Yes.
You know, who's very middle class and very much doing that kind of pastoral, enjoying, and they're having like a real moment that's authentic and lovely and real. But at the same time, if we don't bring that critical reading, it's just going to be the same people getting the reward from clay, I guess. You know.
Yeah, and I think for me this is where it starts to become more about kind of structural conversations rather than the, like, you know, why clay. I mean, my kind of argument is that I don't really care what people make, and I don't think that it really matters. And I think actually there's been I've kind of experienced quite a lot of sort of fear, I suppose, around from kind of craft professionals or kind of ceramic professionals who are really scared about this kind of expanding into the kind of the hobbyist or the kind of this like sloppy craft kind of aesthetic and things, and like what that means for their discipline. And I think especially within higher education, you know, there's a real territory war like going on where, you know, people's livelihoods are connected to this sort of academic space and they're being pushed out. So you can kind of see, I can totally see why they're kind of trying to hold on to these values or these sort of ideas, or that they're scared that, you know, if enough people start messing around with clay, the kind of the aesthetic value is going to get lost somehow. But I just don't think that's true. Like, I think people who want to make things will carry on making things to a very high level, and those people will filter through whichever direction, whether they go to university or not, basically. But I think the thing that I find really interesting and that is sort of key to my PhD research is this idea that now there's an opportunity now in the UK at least, where we've got a real network of these community spaces and kind of artists, individual artists as well, or individual practitioners who are working with clay in a kind of more socially engaged sort of direction. And or are just sort of running businesses where, like you say, people can kind of come in and have a, you know, reasonably priced experience. And that's all fine. But the thing that the point of potential, I think, there is for people like you and me who are the sort of the people who are going in and kind of running these spaces or leading these workshops. It's for us to kind of develop our kind of critical understanding of why we're doing that. And there's a kind of a top-down kind of trickle into how we orientate, how we organize, what values we're putting out, like how we're even kind of setting up our spaces economically, like which business model, which economic model we're using, how we might be able to support each other better, who we're allowing through the doors, what policies we have in place to make sure that those spaces are inclusive, are actually inclusive, who we're employing to make sure that those, that, you know, if we want to have diverse, you know, kind of communities in our space, is that reflected in our employee list? You know, like, so there's sort of very kind of structural things there that I think we can start doing which I get really excited about, because that feels like something different in terms of like how we might, and something really, really concrete that we can actually start building together to sort of centralize clay as a change mate, as an agent for change.
Yeah, and I think some of those things you're talking about are definitely happening in Australia too, like just the fear around but I mean, I think there's some important fears too, where people are using materials very unsafely. That's a big problem in Australia at the moment with the hobbyists. Like, there's a lot of not much education around silicosis and around toxic materials, and they're just being spread around. And we're seeing some pretty scary practices. So I think I understand that, but like what you're saying about the sloppy ceramics and that, it's like, whatever. Like, they're not coming for you, people. It's all right. But yeah, so I mean, I just think I love this idea of this studio model that's really inclusive. I feel like we're just so far from it here. Even just finding a space and funding it, like.
Yeah. I mean, here too, I think. I mean, it was interesting. I did some research over in the US, and obviously the model that's come over to the UK is a US model. They call it like open studios, where you kind of basically have shared facilities, and then it's a bit like a gym membership essentially. You kind of, I'm sure you guys have some of them there.
Yeah, in the big cities we do. Yeah,
but it's interesting because I think the biggest thing that I found that was different in the US is that they have, even the small cities are so much bigger than what we have in the UK, right? So like, the difference between somewhere like, I don't know, even Newcastle where I am to Philadelphia, they're potentially kind of comparative cities, but the population of them in Philadelphia is exponentially bigger, which means that you have ecologies within being able to be held within cities in the US. And so those kind of like support structures have the potential to be able to kind of build quicker, I think. And it's not to say that they have a perfect system. They definitely don't. But it was interesting. I mean, I was particularly seeking out people who were sort of practicing more kind of inclusive ways of working. So I kind of found a few of these things, but especially in kind of Providence, they seem to be having a kind of citywide kind of craft mutual aid sort of thing going on. So, which is really interesting. Whereas in the UK, my shtick is that we're going to have to start thinking nationally, because there's no way that these places can kind of support themselves ultimately if you're working in a rural village in Norfolk or something. Like there's a very large capacity, there's a ceiling of capacity there in terms of your customer base, if you want to talk about it in those terms. And there's going to be a limit to how much you can then rely on that, and how much you can develop from that, and how much you can support both yourself and that community. So we have to start thinking in a much more kind of holistic and much like larger scale in the UK, at least, because like you say, it's very expensive to set these spaces up. It's even more expensive to run them, especially with the sort of energy crisis and things, and that's only going to get worse. So it's like trying to really think about, and this is my like end goal anyway, is to try and kind of create a support system for these spaces, or collectively with these spaces, where we can start thinking about other ways of organizing and supporting each other kind of outside of capitalist systems. So instead of just thinking about, okay, well, I need money in order to do this thing, like a lot of, again, like you say, a lot of the issue with starting up these practices, I think, is knowledge. Where do you get that? And there's a lot of time invested in trying to sift through best practices, or trying to find a policy or write a policy around how to deal with your toxic materials even, whereas if we can kind of find ways of sharing that knowledge, I think hopefully my hope anyway is that we can start building much more sustainable practices and communities for each other.
It sounds great. And I think you've hit on something really important there. There's a lot of really goodwill in the world, I think, especially around these community studios. And maybe, like, I know a conversation we've had in our local Potters Club is like, how do we change this demographic we're seeing in our club? Like, how do we change that to be more inclusive? And there's not many ideas there. Like, it's a bit like, oh, you know, because a lot of it is really systemic and really deep. And that's something I found in your podcast was really interesting, is hearing those stories in the States about people who are experiencing homelessness making ceramics, you know, like something that I feel like would be shut down instantly here, being like, that's not what people need. They need beds and food. But to see that actually creating something, and there's some empowerment in that that's just wonderful. And it's something I feel like I could do as a practitioner too, is I'm not going to be running a soup kitchen, but I could help people make a bowl. Yeah.
Well, and two things are true, right? Like, clay isn't going to stop homelessness. You know, like, people have very fundamental issues that impact their life, like on ways that, you know, creativity is not going to fix, because these are kind of systemic, socially economic kind of issues that we have, that there's just no way, it's not our place to fix them, I think, either. Like, we can start building something in a grassroots level that supports them. And I think the thing that what I found, both as a practitioner working with sort of vulnerable communities at certain points with sort of projects, and speaking to other people who do that kind of thing much better than I ever did, is that when we as artists go into those spaces, it's really important to understand what we're offering and what we can't offer. Because if you're going into spaces, and I think there's a lot of, certainly in the UK, there's a lot of this, there's a kind of an attitude that as an artist, you should just be able to do anything. And that, you know, you can just like walk into a group of people, like, for instance, teenagers in crisis, and just be able to deal with whatever comes, and just like do a nice project with them, and then that's sort of fine. And actually, that's not good enough. Like, it's a dangerous situation to be in, because I'm not a social worker. Like, I don't know how to, you know, apart from being a teenager in crisis at some point, like, I don't have the skills in order to kind of like support them through those issues. However, like you say, having an experience outside of therapy, outside of their kind of normal life with clay, is an incredibly potent experience for them to start building up their resilience, their kind of sense of confidence. So there is something incredibly valuable that happens within the spaces that we can facilitate. But if that isn't done in relation to other support networks, we come up against a problem, and a really dangerous one for everyone involved, I think, especially if you're like specifically talking about that. And I think the same thing happens when you're talking about kind of opening up your spaces and kind of creating more inclusivity, is that if you're not, you have to be okay with getting it wrong. And that's really scary for people. And you have to be okay with being told no. And that, you know, with all the will in the world, you have to understand that, especially as a white person, people may not trust you. And that's totally fine. You kind of have to just keep on doing the thing, like learning, you know, keep being open to those conversations. But it's much easier just to kind of sit in a bubble and just kind of keep on working with the same people. It takes a lot of work to change those systems that we're all impacted by. But I think it's work that's really worthwhile doing.
Yeah, me too. It's the work, really.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's another thing, it's another shift in sort of ceramic culture or kind of craft culture, that we need to start thinking outside of our box. That, like, as a discipline, it's been incredibly insular, I think. Again, certainly in the UK. And actually this sort of idea of like looking adjacent and being like, oh, well, I can just partner with my local charity who works with homeless people, or, you know, people who are experiencing homelessness or whatever. You know, you don't have to do everything yourself.
Yeah, we're lucky, I think, living in a smaller area there's also more access to that, which is really good.
Yeah. And what I've found is that often people really want it. Like they're really, they're constantly, it's amazing how much we don't talk to each other. Like it's really, I find it fascinating that people just sort of stay in their lane. Like, and again, I think that's a kind of an institutional thing that for me, I think kind of filters down from education, like the kind of the disciplines of university where it's all kind of tied up to funding access essentially. And if you're not like very specific about which areas and, which disciplines you're in, it's very difficult to kind of move across and kind of create a story which will get funded. But yeah, I think increasingly people are sort of beginning to realize, or just really open to the idea that like you have a skill, this other person has a skill, you both have sort of similar values. What happens if you put those things together?
Yeah, it's exciting. One project that's come across my radar that you spoke briefly about in the podcast was Fired Up for Clay. So my background is I worked with young people who had been excluded from education. I was a teacher in alternative settings for the last 15 years. It's my background before I came to Clay. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering if you've seen any of the Fired Up for Clay studios and if you want to share anything about that. No worries if you don't.
Well, so Fired Up for Clay, as far as I'm aware, first off, it's not my project. So it's something that I came across. It was Fired Up for Clay. I'm pretty sure this is right. Was set up by the artist Kate Malone, who was actually one of the first judges on the Pottery Throwdown. Just to like link that back. So Fired Up for Clay was a funding campaign essentially for a charity called Onside, which creates custom built after school clubs or after school facilities for children, where they're like, I think they kind of focus on the arts and sport. So the two things are being systematically taken out of the rest of our education system essentially. So really, really important work. And they kind of have various hubs all over the country. I haven't actually been to any of them, although I did drive past one the other day, which was quite fun. But as far as I'm aware, what they're doing is just sort of they're building facilities so that people can have access to kind of quite high level equipment for various things in various capacities. And they're providing that as a kind of free or kind of accessible space for children to come after schools. And the thing that Fired Up 4 did was, again, I'm remembering a conversation I had with Kate, is that she got Onside to commit to putting ceramic facilities into all of their new developments. So it's now something that is going to be built into any of their new facilities. And I think they've sort of retrofitted a few of them as well. So that's what that is. And I think this again is like to kind of expand it out beyond just that particular project. I think that's the thing that's sort of interesting about this sort of movement of community studios or kind of alternative education spaces, kind of craft education spaces, is that they are servicing the entire lifespan of people, not necessarily all in one space. But, you have people who are working with prenatal women or people who are having children, right the way through up to kind of dementia care. So you're getting Clay has somehow managed to infiltrate this really interesting kind of lifespan of engagement. Where it's some of these spaces are working specifically with children or like I said, sort of people who have just given birth or are about to give birth, through to sort of teenagers in various different ways, through to kind of adults in lots and lots of different ways, and then right the way through up to kind of people who are in geriatric care and various other things like that as well. And it's getting into prisons, it's getting into like schools again. You know, it's really interesting how versatile this material is in terms of how many people and how many kind of lives it can touch and how many experiences it can facilitate and hold. I just get really passionate about it. Like, I mean, it's been an interesting journey for me. Like, people keep on asking me, because I don't really make anything anymore. My entire world has sort of become about creating this sort of network that I want to launch hopefully in the next year probably, which is going to be called the Clay Commons. So it's this sort of idea of producing a commons, which is a set of resources stewarded by a community under a set of values. And so for me, that's ceramic and community knowledge, or clay and community knowledge, stewarded by all of us, and then under these kind of set of like kind of anti-capitalist, kind of inclusive values. And to sort of the potential of that, I think, is incredibly exciting. And there's just so much amazing practice that is already happening out there. Internationally, I mean, that's the thing that I find, again, really exciting. You know, as much as I think it's important to kind of bring it back to the kind of the material of what we're doing, you know, the kind of the sort of physical experience of working with clay, and working with each other, is you can't replace that. However, in terms of like creating spaces for connection and knowledge transfer, the internet is incredible. And to be able to kind of connect to you guys over in Australia and to kind of hear the same thing, you know, the biggest lie that capitalism and kind of colonialism told us was that we were alone and that we're that we kind of have to do everything on our own. And that's just not true. You know, there's so many people out there who are thinking about clay in more expanded ways and sort of thinking about how we can kind of build societies and communities around it. And that's what it used to do. We used to build community, and people still do build communities around it. And like I said earlier, I think that's what we've kind of lost within kind of Western society, sort of post-industrialization. That focus on the sort of connecting, the ability to connect, and those sort of spaces that you're creating. It takes work, but it doesn't. But I think this is why, like, kind of podcasts and all of these kind of different forms of communication are really important, because, like you say, it's, you know, it's like picking up a really good book and realizing that there's another voice out there that kind of is having the same experience as you. You know, podcasts are now this other way of kind of reaching into different studios and across land and things. And it's yeah, I've certainly found, well, friends through it, really. So yeah, it's a great medium.
Yeah. Excellent. I feel like that was a good little moment to kind of wrap up on. Is there anything else you want to speak about, though? Because, like, you know, we didn't talk about any of the projects of the past or that I had there.
I mean, not particularly. I mean, that project was a kind of an interesting one, because actually it kind of showed me what not to do rather than what to do in some ways.
Is that the Material Action Project?
Yeah, the Material Action. Because it was a classic example of what we were talking about earlier, where you know, artists were just kind of like put in front of a problem, and sort of expected to produce something of meaning that would change the attitude of a community that was basically just being bulldozed because of some gentrification that was happening in their area. Which, you know, I mean, we took the money, we did the project. It certainly did our careers a lot of good, but it was, it made me feel pretty icky. You know, like, you kind of launched into this thing and then suddenly we're kind of up against, like, learning in real time what it actually means to be doing projects like that, and, you know, coming up against real life problems, which we weren't really equipped to deal with. And again, it's, you know, I think, like I said, all three of us, because I did that project with my then collective Matter, with Katie Spragg and Mary O'Malley. And I think all three of us sort of went out from that and very clearly started stating boundaries, and sort of saying what we needed, and sort of seeking out projects where we were actually getting support and sort of thinking about like that, for me at least, was the first time that I really started thinking across sector, sort of really understanding like the importance of holding kind of creative space, but understanding that that experience both is extremely valuable and needs to be protected, but the only way you can actually properly protect that and kind of create a sincere experience for people within that is if the other support is already scaffolded in, and also if you're kind of walking into a community as a sort of transient artist, there's no trust there. So you kind of the way that the sort of shortcut, if you don't have the capacity to like embed yourself in those communities, is working with people who are already embedded.
It's amazing that trust that gets transferred if there's somebody from that community that you have a relationship with pre the project. I've noticed that myself. Yeah.
And I think a lot, certainly in the UK, there's a lot of projects, a lot of communities are really jaded because, they get people approaching them all the time, sort of being like, oh, I've got this really great idea, let me work with you. And it's like, well, what are you actually giving me here? Because you're going to come in, you're going to create a facility or a kind of experience for our community for 6 months, and then you're going to disappear. So what does that actually do for me? It doesn't do anything. So again, I think this sort of idea of time that we were talking about in terms of how we might be able to start pushing against that is really building our projects with much more longevity in mind, which is complicated because that's not how the funding doesn't like that. It prefers to kind of have 6 months and then a big fancy, press like photo op at the end. But really sort of thinking about how we can kind of, thinking clay time. So we're sort of thinking way beyond our lifetimes rather than just the sort of immediate smash and grab,
Yeah, I think it's really important that you shared that though, because it's good to hear how these projects that make us feel icky and have kind of failed or feel wrong then inform our practice. Like, you have to have experiences like that. I've had them too, like where you're like, I'm going to do this great thing and it all looks great on paper. And then you go in and the community's like, why are you here? Like, what's this about? Yeah.
And the thing that I always, when people ask me about that, I always sort of say, I don't think it was a failure per se, but it was definitely it's not a project that I would repeat. And I think it's really important to kind of say those things because I could tell a different story of that project. And actually, like I said, it has promoted me and my career. I've got jobs out of that project. And especially around like kind of academic framing, there's a lot of what I think are kind of lies that are kind of like I was involved in another project fairly recently through a university, and it was this tiny little event that I did, and it got blown up out of all proportion where the university kept on asking me to like write a paper on it and do this other thing and this other thing and this other thing to like make it seem much bigger than it actually was. And it felt, again, like I could feel myself getting pulled into that kind of very uncomfortable space. Like it didn't feel right because I knew that project did a thing, but it certainly didn't do all of these things that I was capable of saying it was doing. And I can attach other ideas to it that kind of make it feel a lot bigger. But the actual crux of what that project was very limited. And I think it's really important to understand and to start sharing that practice quite openly, actually, because there's a lot of, I don't think it does anybody any favors. Like I think, and especially if we're sort of thinking about trying to kind of build a new or kind of different way of working with each other, I think it's really important to kind of point out where we go wrong or where we sort of start to sort of feel uncomfortable about certain things that we're being asked to do or certain framings of things within certain discipline, like certain, how these projects can actually get weaponized in some ways, like personal or institutional gain, essentially. which happens all the time.
Yeah, this is like an amazing benefit, I guess, of stepping outside the institution and creating grassroots models too, is that we don't have to play those games. We don't have to publish the big shiny article that says all these people were saved and it was fantastic and these outcomes, you know, as we can be real. We can say, actually, that didn't work and that's okay. Or I'm not going to do that. That makes me feel uncomfortable, because it'll be more of that self-run, community run. And I think it's really exciting.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that's the thing that I find very exciting about all of these conversations that we're having, and also the kind of the material conditions of what we have in the UK, at least, with these kind of critical mass of studios essentially, and kind of community spaces and practitioners, is that we're at a crossroads. You know, like there's a moment here where we can actually really tangibly start practicing something different, and kind of intentionally thinking about all the different levels which a ceramic studio holds. You know, you've kind of got economic models, you've got social models, you've got making practices, and like even how, you know, we start to sort of think of or frame skill-based learning, you know, actually saying where these skills come from, or kind of touching on sort of different histories and kind of global histories and bringing that into the classroom. Not everybody's going to be interested in it, but you'll probably find, even if we just start to bring that, you know, that awareness into that room, I'm sure at some point, like, you'll catch some people. And I think I often sort of think of clay as a bit of a kind of gateway drug sometimes. You know, it kind of gets people into the room and like hooked in a much better way than like heroin or something. But you know, it's much healthier.
Much healthier.
But you know, it gets people into the room, and you kind of have this amazing kind of potential for a kind of captive, very open audience who are kind of interested in this material, and that material has a lot that it can scaffold onto because it's so culturally diverse and been part of our kind of global history for forever. And it goes across all the sort of disciplines as well. You know, you can have a conversation with an astronaut about clay and their kind of ceramic brake pads, or you can have a conversation about with an anthropologist or a doctor or a dentist, you know, like, or an artist, you know, like, and all of these people will have some kind of understanding of how that material is used.
I had a young Murray guy, First Nations guy that I was working with, and he's like, "Do you do that pottery thing, Jane?" I was like, yeah, you know, on the wheel. He's like, "Yeah, I do that." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, yeah, I do that. I do that on my phone. I throw on like this pot on the wheel and I trim it, and I'm like, okay. He was really keen to have a proper go. So, and you know, 17-year-old into hip hop, like, that was, amazing.
Yeah, it's so great. Like, I mean, like I said, I think clay's amazing. I think it's great. I mean, my kind of motto at the moment is Octavia Butler. I don't know if you know her. She's a writer, Afrofuturist writer, and she's got a book called Parable of the Sower. And one of the sort of the story is about kind of creating a new religion around this idea of God as change. And part of the sort of scripture that she writes is changed. Clay is change. And that really resonates with me. You know, I feel like if we start thinking about clay, not ceramic, we're starting to think about potential fluidity, really understanding that things can be kind of made, connected, pulled down again. That knowledge is sort of remains in the material, and you then rebuild it, you know, and you just keep on going. And that's like an inherent part of clay practice. And I think a really important way of kind of trying to move through the world as well.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Eva.
That's all right.
Oh, wow. I could ask you so many more questions, but I feel like you'll probably need to get on with your day. Is there any last things you'd like to say?
I don't think so. I mean, just thank you so much for reaching out. It's like, you know, as much as we were kind of talking about this work being about connection, I'm doing it within a PhD. Like there's a paradox there in terms of it being a very individualized research experience. So it's, and you put these things out there, and it's just amazing that it means so much that like you reached out and that the work is resonating and it's doing what I hoped it would do. So it's fantastic. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and to speak to your listeners. And yeah, hopefully we can kind of continue to build this community internationally. And we're not alone.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it really has. Thank you so much, Dane. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Eva.
it.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed. You can find us on Instagram at birdsofclay_podcast. Please feel free to send us any questions or comments. And if you could leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening on, that would be amazing. We'll see you next time.